Greetings, fellow philosophers. This is going to be a brief introduction to Socrates and Meno. In the next video, or voiceover PowerPoint, excuse me, we'll have a longer introduction to the philosophy of Socrates and Plato. But for this first, very briefly, I'll give you a bit of an introduction to Socrates, and then we'll go into some more detail a little bit later. Socrates is the first of what are considered the great three Athenian philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We don't really have anything from Socrates himself. He didn't write anything. In fact, he could neither read nor write. But he did consider himself to be the wisest of all men because he at least stated that he didn't think he really knew anything. So what he often would do would be enter into dialogue or conversations with the individuals that he was disputing with, and we have a record of those. And the record we have actually comes from his student Plato. But we get the term the Socratic dialogue from this the way that he interacted with people and the exchange of ideas, and oftentimes he would corner people in their own internal contradictions of thought. And the dialogues that we have are records of that. And we will be reading one of them right now. Here are some of the events that marked the history of Socrates. You can see the timeline here when he was born and when he died, and some of the other events that were taking place in the region at the time of his life. You may recall that Socrates, at the end of his life, was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens. He was challenging a lot of the assumptions of his day about the gods and about the politics of the time. And if you know anything about his life, you know that at the end, rather than accept the banishment out of Athens and to live a life of his own, on his own, he decided that he would take the alternative punishment, which was to end his life through drinking a poison. We could talk a little bit more about that later, about why he chose that. But for now, you get the idea that this was a very principled individual who lived in very turbulent times. And part of his quest was to find truth in the middle of all. A map that shows the city-state of Athens at the time of his life. You can see where Athens is, and you see Sparta on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and these two were at war, and eventually that war led to Sparta actually conquering Athens around the time towards the end of Socrates' life. What we're going to be looking at is our very first reading is Meno, written by Plato. Again, we don't have anything that was written by Socrates, but it is a dialogue between Socrates and Gauson about the idea of virtue, especially can virtue be taught. And this is a very appropriate first essay for us to consider, because as we will see, the thinkers, the philosophical thinkers that we are going to be reading, are very concerned about virtue, not just about how people learn, but how people learn to become good. And the very first question that we're going to deal with is, can this actually be something that can be learned? Is virtue something that can be learned? And if it can be learned, then how can it be taught? And the very first question that we're going to be wrestling with is that very one. And so the language is a bit rough at first to get used to. It might take a little bit of time to read this article and to answer the questions. But the questions that I have, the reading guide that I have in the form of a series of questions, will guide you through all of it. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and read the articles and to go ahead and complete the guide. And what I would want from you in an answer to a question in the guide is just a one-sentence answer to the question. Most of the questions can be answered simply in one statement. And then to provide the ground or the reference from the text that supports your answer. Where in the text do you find that particular answer to the question? And if you can, if it's an important enough question, go ahead and provide an illustration that helps to support your point. So with that, you can go ahead and begin reading. And what I will do after you read, I'll have another introductory video, or voiceover PowerPoint actually, that will kind of summarize some of the key points.